Hey, Chris.
Hey, Heather, how are you today?
Yeah, I'm okay. Fancy seeing you at this coffee station in the workplace.
Yeah, the workplace. Yes, indeed. It's a little different today. It's
What
not a
is it?
Wednesday, it's a Friday.
Oh,
And
thought it was a different drink.
oh,
What are you drinking?
yeah, since it's not morning right now, I have a green tea with mint.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Lovely.
I guess you would have the green tea with mint without the green tea, since
Actually, I am drinking something that has leaves in it, but I don't know what it is because I froze it like
Hmm.
3 years ago and and I'm just taking the leaves out of the freezer and
Hmm.
sticking them into hot water. And I'm not sure what it is I'm drinking. I think it's like lemon verbena or
Hmm.
something like that,
Just
but it could be stronger.
yeah, I promise not to tell the DEA on you.
They don't have, I was going to say they don't have jurisdiction here, but New York City Police has an office in Bogota. So,
Really?
yes,
Wow.
it's a whole other topic of conversation that I'm not prepared to have, but it's like New York Police has offices for immigration purposes around the world.
Oh my word. Yeah, definitely something pertinent, but perhaps for another day because it
Yeah,
looks
because
like
I can't say
something.
anything
Yeah,
else.
it looks like there is something that you are interested in talking about today. I know you and I were chatting just a little bit earlier, so if you would be interested to share that, I would be delighted to listen.
Yeah, I think it was, I don't know, it was within the past week that I got an Al Jazeera news alert. And it was the title of the article was "The Protests in Serbia Are Historic. The World Shouldn't Ignore Them." And then the subheading is "Amid democratic backsliding across Europe, Serbian student protesters have shown the way to reimagining democracy and governance." And well, I had heard nothing about anything happening in Serbia. And so it did indeed seem like my world's where I get my news was ignoring them. So it was really interesting to me because when I told you about it, you shared with me an article called "Resistance is Alive and Well in the United States." And then its subheading thing says protests of Trump may not look like the mass marches of 2017, but research shows they are far more numerous and frequent, while also shifting to more powerful forms of resistance. And when obviously I wanted to read that article. And so I started to compare and contrast them. And what I love about what is happening in Serbia, and by the way, these protests were sparked because of the collapse of a roof in a train station, which sadly killed 15 people, which then sparked protests and then a backlash and then protests against the backlash. It's this. Let me quote from the Al Jazeera article, which of course we'll link to in the show notes. It says, at the end of the mass rally, hundreds of taxi drivers showed up to drive the students back to Belgrade. The residents of this particular town, and I won't try to pronounce it, accommodated in their homes around 700 protesters from out of town. 700. Citizen solidarity with the students has been spectacular. So when I read about resistance in the United States, it seems more individualistic. I don't see people doing things that are so far out of their comfort zone, like this kind of citizen solidarity. And obviously, maybe it's just not being reported, but I just don't think so. And the article you shared, which is on the Waging Nonviolence website, it describes economic non cooperation like strikes, boycotts. Um, Individual participation is deliberately obscure, it says, and it's causing Tesla stock to drop. People are calling in sick from work or school, refusing to buy, and doing stay-at-home demonstrations. But all of that sounds really individualistic to me. They're not demanding, well, maybe it's better to say, they're not inviting people to be in relationship with each other, like in Serbia, hosting people in their homes, taxi drivers going out of their way to pick up students who probably don't have money for taxis. It's just very hard to imagine that happening in the US. And, because there's this lack of relationship. And again, quoting from the Al Jazeera article, it says students have developed effective self governance through student plenums or assemblies where each student has the right to speak and all decisions are voted on. Ad hoc working groups are put in place to deal with various issues from security and logistics to PR and legal questions. The university occupations function without a discernible leadership, alternating the representatives who speak to the public. They are adamant about their autonomy, vocally distancing themselves from all political parties and party politics, as well as from established civil society organizations and even informal groups. And it continues by saying, in doing so, they are creating a new political space and new means for the political to be enacted, breaking through the confines of ossified institutional politics and representative democracy. And it goes on to say that students have created what could be called disobedient institution. And of course, what the article about the United States suggests is that there is some disobedience going on. People are staying home from work, refusing to do their jobs. But in Serbia, it looks more like a fresh way of being in relationship with one another in a way that maybe wasn't there before, and in ways that we don't see much in the United States. And although in Serbia they're talking a lot about students, in reality, workers from various institutions, businesses, and a number of professional associations have joined the strike. So there's solidarity from the Bar Association, from public transportation company workers, public pharmacies, unions, people rising up against the privatization of their respective sectors. It says, quote, as liberal democracy is retreating before the forces of illiberalism, authoritarianism, and techno-fascism, while facilitating their rise, there is a different need to formulate alternative societal and political imaginaries, and the students of Serbia have shown the way. And that just seems like a very visionary response to what we're seeing happen across the world. Last night, I was on a webinar with anarchists from Argentina, and they've been talking about what they've been doing in the face of President Milei, who's someone very similar to Trump and Musk. And what was interesting is that they didn't start anything new because they already had in place for at least a decade, like their anarchist work and the forms of organization, the way that they organize neighborhoods. This enables, like ways to meet each other's needs and enables there to be organization around protests. And in Argentina, the protests were first led by retired folks who couldn't afford to live on their pension anymore. And then, of course, students were there too. But what was really interesting and cool was how these football fan clubs said, oh, we're going to go out there and protect the retired people from the police. And the point being that in the United States, this so-called resistance doesn't seem to be undermining business as usual. I can totally imagine that if the Democrats won again, they would think, job done, rather than, oh, look, we've learned a new way of being with one another. We're not putting faith into state institutions anymore. And I know that, I don't know which podcast, but you and I have talked about this before, and I referenced the book Up From Under the Rulers by H. Peter Steeves, and how he points out that we are putting some of what it means to be human, we are offloading that onto institutions who aren't humane. They can't possibly respond to our needs as we have them as unique individuals. So that, the idea of like you get diagnosed with an illness and then people start treating the illness rather than treating you as a person. And I think that's what Serbia and Argentina show us, because it's like let's embrace and engage with a different way of relating with one another to meet our needs rather than the kind of resistance that we're seeing in the United States.
Yeah, I think that it's important to highlight what is going on in the world, specifically through the lens of relationship, which is something that certainly you have done consistently as long as I've known you and your work. There are many thoughts that come to mind when I think of, let's say, Serbia, Argentina, also Turkey, as I listen to what you're talking about. I have been watching Romanian news most mornings because I'm learning Romanian for reasons that I'll perhaps get into another time. And just a couple of days ago, there was footage of protests in Turkey because I believe some things have happened and the details escape me. But protests began when one of the major opposition leaders to the president of Turkey was jailed. And then I believe, and I feel silly because I don't know if they're the same person or not, but the mayor of Istanbul also, um, I believe, was jailed. And there are a couple of things that come to mind, particularly though, when I saw the footage of the protests, I thought to myself, where did all the flags come from? And maybe this sounds a little bit silly, but there were many people holding flags that appeared to be of the same type. And I'm not talking about what was on the flags. I'm talking about they literally looked like the same size with the same plastic handles. And I thought to myself as I watched that, okay, there's infrastructure here in place to actually support what is going on. And what is the nature of that infrastructure? Where's the funding coming from? Because none of this is for free. And who is supporting it? Who is responsible? And that's just talking about a flag. What about childcare for the people who have gone out to protest? Elder care as well. You're not working. What about your bills? I mean, we're talking about protests, not small, but large scale, nationwide protests, multi day protests. I did see footage more recently this week of protesters being beaten by police, protesters being sprayed by some kind of, I don't even know what it is, being pushed back by riot police with those plastic shields. So now we're talking about medical care. We're talking about all types of treatment, food, water. So when I look at this, I think to myself, there's infrastructure in place. And you and I often talk, or I have a habit certainly of talking about business processes and basically what are the things that need to be in place to get from point A to point B. And it really makes me wonder, what are the things that we can learn? What are the lessons that we can learn from those types of events outside of the United States? What can we learn from those regarding infrastructure building inside the United States? And I also have just on the side of my mind somewhere that the United States itself has a history of funding resistance and other types of protests in other countries. And that's a long and extensive history for some other day. But this also comes to mind almost as a term of irony. So it's like maybe there are protests in the past that were big and massive and had all these flags and all this I don't know, elder care, health care, child care, transportation, because the United States was funding them. Well, who's going to fund our protests here in the United States of America? So I'm trying to be careful here and not generalize, especially because the details escape me. But these are some of the thoughts that I've had over the last couple of days, and also in the context of reading the resistance article that I had shared with you earlier.
Yeah. Um, yeah, the US definitely has motivations for funding protests in some places and not in others, and usually not in the United States. Um, yeah, and then you just reminded me that when I was looking up Serbia today to see what the latest was, that I saw in the week, the publication The Week, that 500,000 people have signed a petition alleging Serbian police used an illegal sound cannon to disrupt anti-government protests. So I looked for the video and so the other thing that I think like you I think it said that it's a US made weapon. So this is a way that the US can influence the protests around the world and also experiment. And so I'm thinking, yeah, I would expect to see that kind of weapon being used in the US and here in Colombia one day, and it looks pretty terrifying. Um, and yeah, I think all of that infrastructure that's needed for a protest, for some people it's they don't have anything else to do. Like in Argentina, they don't have jobs. They don't have to worry about missing work. Um, and people will have to leave children with other people. Like people just have to support each other in that way. And I think the infrastructure for that is better in places like not the United States usually. But I'm just remembering as well some protests that and I was part of Extinction Rebellion in the UK, and we would go to a protest, and there would be an organization outside the subway tube stations who would hand out these signs, that had their logo on it. So it's like in their interest to like put money into this because it gives their organization more legitimacy. But then the main part of the sign was like the message. And so people would take it because they wouldn't think, oh, I don't want to accidentally support this organization. They just kind of ignored the bottom and were just like, oh, so that's why it was uniform. And everyone had those. So, and it is problematic. I think that organization uh, is problematic, and I won't say the name of it in case there's two that sound similar, and I don't want to get one of them wrong. But yeah, so it is interesting to think about how if there's obviously some kind of conformity going on, like with flags or signs, that something's going on. And then in terms of who's able to protest, yeah, I mean, with Extinction Rebellion, it was, yeah, more privileged people. So they normally could afford to do something like that.
So the ideas of privilege, uniformity, infrastructure, there are other thoughts coming to my mind based on some very recent events, and perhaps we could find an article later. You may have shared one with me just yesterday, or perhaps one of our friends did, about several university professors, I believe at Yale, who have decided to leave and go to Canada instead. And the responses to this covered a spectrum, but a spectrum that appeared to me to be familiar and not an unusual perspective. That is to say, why would you leave this country? Shouldn't you stay and fight? And I've seen different aspects of this conversation from different people. Because it's something that comes up repeatedly and certainly has come up in a number of circles over the past couple of months here in the United States. But this article took me back to a statement that I saw. It was probably a couple of months ago, maybe even last year on LinkedIn, where somebody had said, why does it seem like the people with the most privilege act as if they can accept the least amount of risk. And I find it interesting that as you talked about Extinction Rebellion, you said many of the people who came to those protests were quite privileged people, while just whereas just a moment ago you talked about people in Argentina protesting because they don't have jobs, like um, they don't have work, and really probably they don't have very much at all. And I also sense, and again, I'm trying to be careful and not generalize, but there are certainly protests that we've seen across the world where people who are the most vulnerable are some of the people who are out in front. Um, and I find this interesting to think about. I don't have really a coherent way of integrating it all. Certainly not not in the few minutes we have left in our recording today. But I think the realm of resistance in America can be talked about in different ways. So there is an idea of privilege, the idea that, okay, my life is comfortable, I don't have too much to worry about. There is an idea regarding individualism, and I would say, yes, there is aspects of individual culture, but also there is a decades long history of slowly whittling away and dissolving relational type institutions. And people certainly talk about the history of unions and where unions are now versus the 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on. Um, so when I think of why resistance in the US may look less united, less relational, and more individualistic, these are some things that come to mind. It's cultural, it's infrastructural, and perhaps it's wealth related at all as well. Wealth related in the context of privilege, being comfortable, not wishing to become uncomfortable, and yeah, it is a very interesting contrast with some of the other protests that we've just talked about today.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a lot of these, what Tima Okun has identified as white supremacy culture patterns, the right to comfort that people with privilege and power want to be kept comfortable. Um, there's individualism is another one, fear of conflict. A lot of these can play out more in middle classes. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm loath to judge individuals on their choices because, like, what if someone had a trans kid, Like, I'm not going to say you should stay and make your trans child put up with whatever's happening in the United States. Um, and also, I mean, these particular professors, they specialize in fascism, so I quite I quite like that they're kind of standing up and going, "You're not having me yell." Um, and I'm not sure Canada is a safe place to flee to. So, I mean, it'll be part of the United States soon enough, right? So, they haven't left really. The US will find them. So yeah, I just think this kind of like I've spoken about the book Joyful Militancy and how it uses the term common notions, which is like principles and values that kind of invite us to not get pulled into the binary thinking and the judgment and the
Mm-hmm.
so I'm just trying to be like more like curious, like we don't know why people are making the choices they're making, but obviously, yes, we wouldn't want like every white person to flee the country and leave um, people of color stuck there with white supremacists, Like obviously like that that is not good. But it's yeah, we I don't know. When I'm talking about individuals, I feel more like less judgmental in that sense and just want to be open and curious to what these folks are doing. You don't know. They could be leaving loads of money behind to support migrants or trans families or, and they're quite outspoken about Trump. So, I mean, it's
Mhm.
not like they're quietly hiding away to stay safe. So, yeah, it's just interesting.
As we wrap up today, I want to mention very briefly a recording that you actually did with a good colleague earlier today. And within that recording, which perhaps we can place into the show notes, you talked about um, the ways in which we can get curious about ourselves and about other people. You use a little bit different language than what I'm using right now. But within the context of our conversation today, I'm also leaving with a sense of curiosity. And it's at multiple levels because you talked about in that recording earlier today how do we uncover what is ours to do in the world? And there is a distinction between the self and the other, and we've talked a little bit about some of those distinctions. I may have mentioned in the past micro solidarity, this idea of a fractal view of belonging, to use their language, that we are individuals, but we also exist in relationship, and we can cultivate the inner and the outer as well. There is what I believe is a reality that we don't have control over other people, but we do have influence, which for me is another way of saying relationships exist, relationships are real. And so, what I'm going away from our recording today with is this idea of how can I be curious about the different levels, those different realms of the fractal, curious about where I am today and in these times. I'm curious about where my relationships are and what does that mean for the work that is mine to do now versus, let's say, what it may have been a year ago or 2 years ago, or perhaps even last month. So, everything that's happening in the world is, I believe, maybe not something to judge in that context, but something to be curious about, to be inspired by. Um, and that's, of course, not my way of saying everything that's happening in the world is actually good. No,
Mm.
it's my way of saying that in observing the world, we're able to uncover more information about ourselves and really about the universe. And that can be very abstract. But more and more I think about the context for our own actions and how we can learn more about that context by being more curious, being better listeners, and
Mm.
really being more active in many ways. That's what I'm going away with today.
Yeah, and speaking to that is an event that you and I are going to be running in about 10 days, which is exactly like figuring out what your role is in the world. And it's called Supporting Livelihoods in Uncertain Times. It'll be at, well, 9 a.m. Central Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9, 3 p.m. UK, 4 p.m. West Europe. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. And it's three of us coaches coming together to support people on livelihoods. And for me in particular, what I offer in that space is this kind of grounding yourself in what is yours to do in the world. And maybe, Chris, do you want to say what you can support people with?
Yes, absolutely. And before we get to that, I will say yes, this event supporting livelihoods in uncertain times, it is on April 8th. And I know that all of our listeners are listening in from different time zones. It is 9 a.m. GMT minus 5. That's 10 a.m. USA Eastern Daylight Time. And again, we will provide a link in the show notes so that people can take a look at the event, convert it into their time zones, and hopefully register. And as you might imagine, a lot of what I think about is infrastructure and business processes for how people can get from point A to point B. So I'm very curious to see what our event is like because the three of us as coaches each have our own different styles. I would be very interested in supporting people who are talking about how to take their visions and make them real, turn the abstract into the concrete, which touches very much on our podcast and some themes that you and I have discussed for a long time now.
Great, but we will get together for a coffee next week, which will be the week before the event. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to bumping into you and talking about the news of the day.
I am as well. And until then, wishing you a good weekend and see you next time.
You too, Chris. Bye.
Bye. You have been listening to Morning Tinto with Heather Luna and Chris Musay Sequeira. Each time we record, we use the news of the day to be as freshly brewed as possible. So subscribe, follow along, and comment if you can. Let us know what you think, and we will talk to you soon. Bye bye.